Hello, this is Rudayna Abdo with Urban Nibbles, and today we have Marcel Champagne, who is a senior airport planner with a multinational consulting firm. Hello, Marcel.
Hi, Rudayna.
Good to see you, and thank you for joining.
Well, thanks for having me.
I think this is a really interesting one. Airports, mobility, and talk about impact, pandemic. Before we start getting into the details, and I'm going to reflect back on when I was in university, and I recall that friends and family could see me off at the gate, and we didn't have any security measures. And then things started coming with shoes, with the gels, with liquids, and so many other things. Can you just lay the context for us a little bit, historic context of things that have changed in airport operations?
Yeah, well, I think if you, I'm a bit older than you, I think, Rudayna. I'm slightly older. But going back to the time when you were talking about you could go right up to the gate with your friends and family on departure, the changes that have occurred since then, those changes have reflected a series of events that have happened around the world. In the 60s, there had been a number of hijackings that really brought upon the need to screen people before going to the gates. And then we've had, some terrorist attacks, plane bombings, which have brought about baggage screening before the bags are brought into the aircraft. And there's a number of layers in the background that have been implemented that we don't necessarily see either. Baggage screening processes and, pre-screening of some passenger information always happens in the background. So moving forward, since 9/11, we all know things have become more stringent in terms of airport security and screening. And now with COVID, we're paying much more attention to public health. Or we're going to have to pay much more attention to public health in the airport environment, and that will change things both from a process standpoint in terms of what we experience when we fly, but also with regards to the facilities themselves and how they're going to be laid out and planned, and just how people are going to access them. They'll have huge impacts in the future.
So do you think these are going to be temporary measures, or are these going to be here for the long term?
A bit of both. I think moving forward, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, this past week, I believe, issued what they're calling the takeoff guidance, which is, I guess, a framework document to allow the civil aviation industry to relaunch in a safe manner following COVID. And within there's a number of guidelines. So initially, we're going to see some quick hits. How are we going to improve the public health measures within the airport environments? So within aircraft, we're going to be seeing more stringent cleaning and sterilization, but in the airport and the airport facilities themselves, an increased use of contactless processing things. We're all very accustomed to using check-in kiosks and checking in from home and printing our boarding pass or on our phone. We're going to see an increased use of that throughout the airports. We're going to see increased sanitization and cleaning of washrooms, seating, and everything that are frequent touch points. But those are really the quick hits. And over the longer term, we're going to see a bit of a transition from the quick hits to the I guess the more permanent measures, which will include likely things like ultraviolet screening areas, potentially shift or changes in the way we're managing queues in the airports, or some staggering of queuing areas or boarding within the aircraft. And that's going to change the way we move around the airport terminal.
Mm-hmm. What about getting to airports, the mobility to airports? Some cities are well connected by public transit, others are not, but are there implications to that intersection of the context within the urban framework and then getting to the point of arrival and then within the airport?
There will. Right now, with traffic being essentially at a standstill around the world, as traffic increases, we're starting to see in certain airports that the airport terminals themselves aren't accessible to non-passengers. So, the days of picking up and dropping off your friends at the airport and physically going into the terminal, those are going to be limited or inexistent maybe for a little while if that trend continues to expand. But what we're going to see if this actually takes root and stays a bit more permanently, curbside areas at airports will need to change, in that, you know, there's not enough space for all this activity to occur. So parking, some of that will occur in parking lots, where, you know, you'll be driving in and out of parking lots to do your pickup and drop off. There'll be, I guess, vehicle distances potentially in parking lots. I saw a picture recently of a mall in Abu Dhabi, I think it was, and it was a shopping center parkade where every other stall was used, and every other stall had a cone in it to facilitate the distance of people moving around there. So that's going to take up more space. And conversely, in areas where we have public access to the airport, then we'll start seeing a shift of people increasingly using public transit to get to the airport where it's available. And then additional measures will need to be coordinated with public transit providers on how we can facilitate that as well, in terms of sanitization and just capacity as well. More people will be brought to these systems.
I'm thinking of the airports that I've been in and the massive amount of space that's given within the airports, both on the restaurant side, concessions, duty free. Do you think that will change, given that more will be happening off-site? Is there a need to minimize the contact or how long passengers are within the airport facility?
That's an interesting question, because airports generate an enormous amount of revenue from retail food and beverage in the airport terminal. You know, we have seen, like, just from when we were younger, we've seen a huge transition. Airports have become shopping malls in many circumstances. So there will still be, for airport operators, there still will be a push to maintain retail and food and beverage services in the terminals. What type of services that may be up for question? Could we may see more of a showroom type approach for retail in the terminal facility, where you basically go in, it's a showroom, and then you order something on your phone and it gets delivered to you, or it's available for you when you come back from your destination. Or concepts like that may need to be explored. For the food and beverage areas, those will require more spacing. So in existing terminals, those spaces may not necessarily available. So it'll have some impacts over the shorter term, I believe, for those type of revenues and those type of services. Mm-hmm. In the longer term, there'll be a requirement to reconfigure some of the spaces within the terminal to provide more broader space availability.
Mm-hmm. And what about hubs, satellite airports, secondary airports? Do you think there will be a push one way or another? Will there be closures or more of the smaller airports opening up? Is there any sense of how airports themselves and
yeah, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say, because on the one hand, air carriers right now, they're facing significant financial challenges. Mm-hmm. So they will, and they are streamlining their operations. They're considerably reducing the fleet sizes. They'll be reducing. They'll be optimizing their network. So there will be some airports that will be left out of I guess the global networks, particularly some regional airports. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, passengers themselves will be looking towards avoiding some of the large airports and avoiding connections. So there'll still be a demand for smaller airports. It just depends on where the dice fall and which airports at the end of the day will have the financial capability to pull out of this. As we know, with no aircraft flying, no people in the terminal, that means they have no revenues right now. They're facing revenue streams dried up, and some airports, unfortunately, may not survive.
Yeah, I can imagine. You mentioned earlier the infrared. Is that for heat to measure temperature?
Yeah, I meant the ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet, sorry.
UV ray rescreening. So there's been, we know that the UV light process can kill the coronavirus, but it's unclear, anyway, to my knowledge, how effective that is or how safe that is on human beings in terms of, walking through a UV portal. Is that good for your eyesight, or is that like walking through a tanning booth?
To the expert.
You have to cover your eyes, and so that level, there's research that occurs on that, and that I've seen different prototypes of equipment. I just mentioned a portal where you could walk through, but there's also things where the UV lighting cabinets can be used to sterilize equipment that the airport employees are using. Think about scanners that can be sterilized in these UV boxes, which is apparently quite effective.
Mm-hmm. And what about the temperature, taking the temperature scans? Is that something that's going to become?
It'll probably be around for a while, but as we all know, in this particular case for COVID-19, the having a fever means, yes, you are potentially infected by the virus, but you can also be infected by the virus without having a fever. So the effectiveness of that measure is rather limited. But what we saw after SARS in Hong Kong, those temperature scans, not necessarily the individual guns that you see that point to your forehead, but the infrared temperature detector in the passenger terminals, those have remained in some of those airports. So we'll likely see more of those in large airports, particularly where there's a large amount of connecting traffic. But the effectiveness is rather limited in this particular case.
And to learn from that experience, SARS being probably the most relevant to this pandemic, are there things that airports across the world are adopting from airports that already have an advance on these measures?
Not that we're seeing yet. We're still, I think the industry's really we shut down. And now there's been a bit of a period of where everybody has been catching their breath, and now airports are looking towards relaunching and accommodating more traffic when the skies open up again. And the ICAO document that I mentioned earlier, called takeoff guidance, will likely serve as a baseline for airports. Initiatives will change between jurisdictions. Certain countries, it's easier to implement certain measures because the regulatory environments are different. But we will see things. But as going back to the SARS example, the infrared monitoring within passenger areas, that stayed. I think from this, what we're going to see more so is operational measures that will really be aimed at enhancing the sanitization of the public areas and touch points.
Okay. We're now beginning of June, and a lot of airports are going to start opening up in the coming couple of weeks. A lot of countries are opening and encouraging tourism, even countries that were hard hit. Are you familiar with measures that are at play in those ports? Well, both the local airports serving those, but then all of the sending airports that will be connecting to these.
Yeah, well, right now we're seeing. I think that the key thing is the lifting of quarantine measures on arrival in countries. That's really going to change what's going to need to be done, because right now, certain countries, for instance, Canada and the UK, I believe, is starting this tomorrow. There's a 14-day quarantine requirement when you arrive from another country. So in Canada, for instance, the measures that are implied are imposed upon arrival. There's a screening form that you have to fill out, and there's a self-quarantine plan that you have to provide to immigration officials when upon arrival. So that's increasing the amount of time that's needed to go through customs. Fortunately, there's not a lot of traffic right now, so that's not a huge problem. But as we move forward, it will increasingly be a problem, because the self-assessment measures that have been in place will continue to be in place for quite some time, and that will likely transition into I guess a virtual environment through doing it through your phone or in contactless types of kiosks. But moving forward, it's really difficult to say how this is going to transition in the very, very short term in those areas. I think it's going to have to be a concerted effort, and globally there will have to be consistency between the different airports and jurisdictions. And airports or countries that are falling behind unfortunately may see strict travel restrictions imposed upon people arriving from those countries, or segregation of those arrivals in the airports. to keep better screen these arriving passengers.
Mm-hmm. And ancillary services, I'm thinking specifically of airport hotels, airport hotels. Do you think this will be, which will increase the business there as people self-quarantine? Would there be regulations about that?
It could. I haven't really heard much about that in terms of how that type of traffic could influence the airport hotels. Airport hotels generate a lot of business through business travel, of course, and as well as convention travel. So the convention market is essentially, for the next year, I would essentially say this is pretty much a dead industry, or a very, very limited industry. Business travel will largely be influenced on our ability or our willingness to travel for business. A lot of companies or a lot of us are getting used to working from home and having meetings over Skype or Zoom or Teams or Google Groups. So I think that will really come into play for airport hotels in terms of the clientele and the amount of traffic. So, I think everybody's just kind of holding our breaths and say, okay, well, it's going to take a few years to recover. Let's hope it's going to be shorter than that. And then in the meantime, hopefully that we can, just pull through all this together as an industry.
Mm-hmm. This is an opportunity, though, to do whether it's reorganization, whether it's renovations, reordering things. You see that in the last couple of months, lots of restaurants use this opportunity of shutdown to totally revamp and do things. Are airports taking advantage? Are airport facilities doing anything specific, or have they been in the last couple of months, and foreseeing that the next year to two is going to be impacted services, not the kind of numbers that they'd like to see? Are you familiar with any concerted?
Well, yes, I think there is a significant opportunity here. When I mentioned earlier on the expansion of contactless processing, I think we're going to see an expansion of those type of installations in airports. What we're going to see over time right now is those installations are costly to implement. And there's significant regulatory hurdles in different jurisdictions to implement different types of processes. So I'll give you an example. Again, here in Canada, because it's what I know best. Self bag drop is the process where you bring you tag your bags yourself, you bring it to the airport, and you drop it on a belt, and off it goes. There's a regulatory framework that governs how this process works in terms of who's tagging the bag, when that bag tag is actually activated with regards to the airport and the airline handling it, at which point does the transfer become available from the passenger to the air carrier, and etc. So in different jurisdictions, the regulations are different. And so that's why in certain areas it's very, you'll see some countries where you can actually print your bag tag at home, and other countries you can't do that. And so we're going to start seeing a push towards more standardization of this environment, which will allow these investments to occur on a broader scale, and some acceleration of that in the airport environment. So we'll start seeing a bit more of a consistency, hopefully, across the airport industry. Another point is the self-boarding at aircraft. You may have seen this in a number of airports in Europe. You're seeing this where upon boarding, you're not presenting your boarding pass to an airline agent, but you're scanning it, and then this little gate opens and allows you in. There's benefits to using that system because it allows aircraft boarding to occur faster. And in the current health environment, while there's one less contact that you have to have with the person, and this also goes for the employees. They don't have to have face time with 300-400 passengers of the plane as they board. So we're going to see increasing push towards allowing those type of technologies being implemented in more large scale around the world.
So there will be new regulations and new screens, new processes that passengers would have to go through, in addition to having to do everything that we do already. And with technology coming in to facilitate certain things, do you think the overall experience will be shortened or longer, or
I think the
differences?
overall experience will be from end to end.
Mm.
From the first point of contact to the last point of contact will likely be longer, but it's going to occur over a broader space. So this was already starting before COVID. IATA had implemented or had established different programs, and the most current one is called One ID, which basically encourages pushing the whole process out of the airport and encouraging off-site processes. So your check-in offline, your baggage drop offline, or in remote baggage drop areas. So all these processes, the objective was to make the process within the airport more efficient, less space take up because you have less queues, or the queues are faster because a lot of the processing had already occurred. So in this case, I think the self-evaluations and screening processes will be overlaid into these different off-site processes. And when I say off-site, some of it's virtual. It's taking your phone and authenticating yourself through a picture. So I think that's going to be integrated into the overall process, and just make it more standardized within each one of those layers.
Okay. And finally, this is a time for new processes, reflection, opportunity to do things differently. What should we be shedding from old practices, that it's a good time to shed these things, and it's an opportune time to take advantage of this, what's happening now? Can you think of things that should be shed and others that would be welcome to bring forward?
Yeah. I think, and I'm speaking from a general population perspective in terms of travel. I'm convinced that the airline and airport industry will be a very safe place or safe industry to use or to give our business to. The airport industry, the aviation industry as a whole. The number one priority for aviation is safety and security. So it's an industry that's very well versed in these measures. The health and safety measures, public health measures is just going to be an extension of an industry that's very well versed in these type of measures. So on that level, I believe I have no concerns about the aviation industry or their ability to maintain I guess a clean environment for passengers and employees. From a public perspective, what we need to be more aware of is our behaviors in the environments, and we see this everywhere. We go out in the street, people don't social distance very properly, or bringing masks. But also, when we travel, part of the choke points in the airports are very much influenced by our own behaviors. So when we travel with 4 suitcases, well, it takes more time to check in, and our hand baggage, if we got too much hand baggage and we have a lot of things in there that are questioned, that increases your processing time, and that by consequence, it also increases the queuing and the amount of people that are in the queue and the flow. So I think we need to be a bit more aware of how our personal behavior impacts the rest around us, and within the travel environment. I think we need to be, what we need to change is our expectations that we can be bringing everything we want with us when we travel, including the kitchen sink. And we just need to be more prepared before getting to the airport, and just help the industry and the employees there do their job and get us all through safely from our arrival to destination.
Well, I like ending on that point and trying to be lighter, hopefully also cleaner, with cleaner technologies coming forward in the aviation sector in general. But yeah, we don't need to be carrying everything that we do, and whether it's self-regulated or whether it'll be regulated by new standards. Let's see.
Yeah.
We can go talk endlessly about this and have 1,000 other questions, but we'll hold it off here for now. Thank you very much for the insight. Really interesting.
My pleasure.
And it's going to be very interesting to watch the space. We'll be participating in it all as consumers and see how things are going to evolve, no doubt, very dramatically.
It will evolve a lot over the next few years. Hopefully all for the better. I'm confident of that.
Okay, yeah, super. Thank you, Marcel. Great to
You're
see
welcome.
you.
Yeah, you
All
too.
right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.